Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and Yirtzeh Hashem, today we will be completing Nun Gimel Amud Beis as well as learning Nun Dalet Amud Aleph. So we are continuing to cover the very complex Siman Amud Beis in Hilchos Tefillin. We have been discussing lately the complex halachas that pertain to the manufacture of the batim. And we left off in the previous year discussing the halacha of ribua. If you remember, we quoted the Bryce of Menachos. The Bryce of Menachos says, Tefillin meruba'is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. One of the 8 halacha l'Moshe miSinai that we have that govern the making of tefillin is that the tefillin have to be square. And we learned that that means the stitching that goes through the titura has to be square. And now today we're going to continue to discuss what parts of the tefillin precisely have to be square. So we pick up right now on the very bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch on Nun Gimel Amud Beis, near the end of the line. In the beginning of Sif Lamed Tes here, the Mechaber covered the stitching of the tefillin. And we spoke about how this is a machlokes rishonim when the Bryce says Tefillin meruba'is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. What part of the tefillin is it referring to? Rav Papa says right away after that brisa, betifran ubala'achsainon, that the stitching of the tefillin have to be squared, and they have to be precisely squared so that if you make a diagonal inside the square, it will have the proper ratio of the diagonal to one of the sides of the square, so the diagonal will be 2/5 longer than the side of the square. That's how you know that the square is a true square. But so far, we've only covered the need for the stitching, for the tfiris, to form a perfect square. Now, says the Mechaber here on the bottom line, V'tzarech l'rabeya mikoim moishavon. We also have to make the foundation, the base of the tefillin, which we call the titura. The base of the tefillin also has to be precisely squared. So let's take out my pair of tefillin over here. This is a spare pair of tefillin that I have, so it's very convenient to keep it upstairs over here in my little recording room, so I have it handy. So here we have the bottom of the tefillin, right? The bottom of the tefillin, this part that extends out from the bias according to the way we make our tefillin. So the titura, the mokam moishavan, the base, the foundation of the bias, has to be square. Now, I mentioned this already in a previous share. We're going to have to explain how we consider the titura to be square, because when you look at this bias right now, as you can see, this bias does not really look, the titura does not really look like it's square. If you consider the titura as starting up here and ending down here, that is very obviously a rectangle, not a square. So how is it that the titura is considered to be square? And we already explained this, but for those who might not have been at the previous year, I'll explain it again. You see the notch that's cut in here, and you see how at that bottom of the notch we have a straight line? That straight line is considered to be the end of the titura. So where my ruler is on the bias, that's where that's the fourth side of the titura. So the titura is one side, 2 sides, 3 sides, and the fourth side is up here under the ruler, and that is a square. And we can see that even more clearly, I think, when we look at it from the aspect of the bottom of the tefillin. So if I take my ruler and I go down to that notch, right, if that's the fourth side of the box, now you can see how we have a square, how the titura forms a square. So again, the Mechaber said, Tzarech l'rabeya mikoim moishavan, and then the Mechaber continues on to the top of Nun Dalet Amud Aleph, v'gam habatim, and also the bias proper, the actual part of the tefillin that contains the parshiyos, the bottom themselves, the top, also has to be squared. Let's take a look now at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Nun Gimel Amud Beis, Eis Katan Kuf Ayin Vav. V'tzarech l'rabeya, we have to make the Mekayim Moishavan, we have to make the titura of the tefillin squared. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the gamzeh, this requirement for the titura to be squared, most of the poskim conclude that the need for the titura to be square is an integral part of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And the truth is that, according to some, that's really the ikar halacha l'Moshe Sinai. They understand the Gemara when the Gemara says betifran ubala achsainan, that betifran kind of means where the stitching is, which is in the titura. Not so much that the stitching has to form a square, but that the titura has to form a square. And the square of the titura has to be a perfect square, like we described previously, the square formed by the stitches. So it has to be a square that's going to have the proper diagonal. It's going to have a diagonal that's 2/5 larger than the sides. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says a very, very important halacha over here. Even though to have a really, 100% perfect square, so that if you would measure it with a micrometer down to 7, 8, 9 digits, you would find it to be a true square. To create such a square, b'meleches habatim, when we are manufacturing batim, says the Mishnah Berurah, dahainu sheyeh b'tachlis hatzimtzum, so that it should be really 1,000% precise. Says the Chavetz Chaim, who kimat min animna. Chavetz Chaim says it's almost impossible to do that. Nevertheless, whatever a person can do, that is what he is obligated to do. So what did the Chavetz Chaim just say? The Chavetz Chaim just said, we're talking over here about the various parts of the tefillin and how they have to form a perfect square with the proper diagonal, everything else. Says the Mishnah Berurah, in the manufacture of batim, to make a square that is so perfect, we're dealing with molds and we're dealing with hides and stretching them over wooden molds, to be so 1,000% precise, he says it's been a nimna, it's almost impossible. But he says, whatever is possible for a person to do, that's what he's obligated to do. So, how far are we supposed to take that? Nowadays, we definitely have very, very, very sophisticated measuring equipment. We have micrometers that could measure, down to hundreds, thousands of inches, centimeters. So, how precise are we required to be? So, in Dirshu footnote 211, they bring down a very important tshuva from the Yeshiva Zatzal from Rav Moshe Zechet Tzaddik V'Kodesh L'Vracha. Amnam kasa b'shalas tshuvas igris Moshe she'ein tzarich limdoid b'chli medida. We do not have to measure with measuring instruments she'yiyah mechuvan arkay kerach by mamish, to see that the sides of the tefillin, the length and the width, are perfectly matched. Ella, rather, kol shetzimtzem v'diktek kifi yecholtoi. As long as you were careful and you tried to be as precise as you could, l'ravoi, to square it, v'nira la'ayin, this is very important, v'nira la'ayin, shehu meruba, and to the eye, to the naked eye, it looks like it is square. Harei zeh kosher, that is kosher. V'cheinu b'sefer Orchos Rabbeinu, b'shem HaChazon Ish, v'Agayin Rav Yisrael, I forgot his initials, Kanievsky, this is the Stipler, Zechet Tzaddik L'Kodesh L'Vracha, the Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal's father. So, they both say very clearly, we don't have to check our tefillin with micrometers to see that they're 1,000% square. As long as you work to make it square, and to the eye it appears to be square, that is sufficient, that is considered square. Finally, Mishnah Berurah is cut in Kaf Ayin Vav, he says, V'ayin be'ikrei dinim, he sends us to the Sefer Ikrei Dinim. Kaf Ayin Zayin, Mokaim Moishavan. The Mechaber over here was speaking about the base of the tefillin. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hua Titura. That's the bottom part of the tefillin that we call the Titura. Now, what does it mean that the Titura is square? So this is what I showed you at the beginning of this year. Tahainu, Sheyachtoich Hama'abarta Mishneit Stadav. You cut a notch into the Mabarta on both of its sides, right? So we've got a notch cut in over here, and we've got a notch cut in over here. We cut a notch in the Mabarta on both sides. Kedei she'enikar ribua hatitura. So by then, seeing the flat side of that notch, that delineates the fourth side of the titura, and now we have a square titura. Ukedolakaman b'sif memdalet. V'tzarech la'ashkiach ma'oid al zet. Chavetz Chaim says we have to be very careful when it comes to this. Ki kol zeh ma'akev afilu b'di'evet. Because of all of these things that we're discussing, this requirement for ribua is ma'akev even b'di'evet. If you don't have the ribua, then even b'di'evet the tefillin are puzzle. V'gam yesh la'ashkiach be'inyan ha'tfira. And we have to be very careful when it comes to the stitching, that the stitching should be square. I'm going to bring this up to the camera. I want you to be able to see it in detail. So you see how the stitches go in and out of the holes, and the lines have to be straight. They have to meet at the corners, and together everything has to make a perfect square, so that when you measure that all-important alach sign, we're going to get a diagonal that's 2/5 longer than one side of the box. Now, the Mishnah Berurah warns us about a problem that he says was very common, and I drew a picture of this, but I see that it's not going to come out on the camera, so I'm just going to draw a quick, more exaggerated, larger picture, so you'll be able to see it. Okay. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'gam yesh la'ashkiach be'inyan ha'tfira. We have to be very careful with the stitching of the bottom. Why? Ki machmas sha'asofrim oisim nikavim gedolim k'tas. Sometimes the sofrim, the bottom machers, when they drill the holes for the stitches through the titura, right? Because that hole has to pass from the bottom up to the top. So they're drilling a hole through here. He says sometimes they make the holes a little bit large, and therefore nimshach hachut latstadin. Now there's room in the holes so that when the stitching goes in and out of the holes, there's room in the hole. And now, instead of the stitches forming a straight continuous line, you could get steps like this, where one stitch goes over here, goes down in the hole, and then there's room for the next stitch to move up and come up over here, and so on and so forth. Now you don't have a straight line. Now you have steps. And says the Chavetz Chaim, that's a problem. The chut, the tefira, the thread, could move. It has room to move up and down. Now you don't have ribua because you don't have a straight line on all four sides. Then nichnas v'zeh yotzei. You have the line going like this, and even at the corners where it meets at the corner, you could have, instead of having a continuous corner, hello camera, instead of having a corner like this, where the line meets cleanly at the corner, if that hole at the corner is large, what you might end up with is this over here. See, I'll bring it up to the camera, where since there's room in the hole, it doesn't meet cleanly at the corner, and therefore you do not have ribua. Vatitura, 3 lines to the bottom of the Mishnah Berurah. Vatitura tzricha liyos meruba. The titura of the tefillin have to be square. Bein milamalo, bein milamata, both on top and on bottom. Says the Chofetz Chaim, V'achshav nowadays, Ba'aved Yiseinu Arabim, Harbe shein mashkichen al tfilein. There are many that are not careful about their tefillin, sheyu merubayin kadin, that they should be meruba. How many of you have looked at the bottom of your tefillin to see if the stitching on the bottom of your tefillin form a perfect square? Have you ever looked at it? Afilu hamedaktikin b'mitzvahs, even people that are normally very careful with their mitzvahs, yesh she'ein mashkichen, there are those that are only careful, ki im al roi shabbatim sheyu merubayin. A lot of people, if you ask them about the halacha of ribua, all they pay attention to is this square over here. And what do they pay attention to? If the corners are sharp. That's what they're worried about. Are the corners sharp? I have to have ribua. And Rabbi say, that's never a problem. I have a psak from a Rabbi Yashiv that even if you bang the corner of the bias on a table, as long as it looks like it's a corner, it doesn't have to be so sharp. It's not. So that's what they're paying attention to. And if they're measuring anything, they're just measuring this. They're looking at this to see ribua. But we're learning over here that the titura needs ribua, the stitching needs ribua, it needs ribua on top, it needs ribua on bottom. So there's a lot of pieces to this halacha of ribua. And it's ma'akiv even b'di'evet. So it's something that we have to pay attention to. Like the Mishnah Berurah says, Ve'ein mashkichen al titura, they don't pay any attention to the titura to see that it's square. V'al atfiros, they don't pay any attention to the stitches. Shu gamkein me'ikar adin. V'hu davar hanok elasakein. And it's something that if it is a problem, it's relatively easy to fix. So the Chofetz Chaim is urging us to pay attention to this very, very critical halacha. Ois kovay ches. V'gam habatim. So too the bottom proper have to be square. Not like some people are noyig. Lasay shel yad agula beroishay, where they make the shel yad actually round on top. Like the bias of the shel yad itself, they make like a ball. Rak shemerabea titura milamata. And they only worry about ribua, they make the titura of the shel yad square, but the top they make like a sphere. Never saw such a thing, but the Chofetz Chaim says you have some people who do this. Ela beina shel yad ubeina shel rosh yu mirubayim. The proper halacha is that both the shel yad and the shel rosh must be properly merubah. V'hakavana b'hashel rosh, and the intent when we say that the shel rosh has to be merubah is kishe'arba batim yachad yu mirubayim. Remember, the shel rosh is made up out of 4 bottom, right? You can see the lines over here, right? This is 1 bias, 2 bottom, 3 bottom, 4 bottom. There's a separate parsha inside each one. As we're going to learn, these are not just lines that are engraved on the outside of a box. Each one of these is an independent box. Each one of these has its own independent wall going down in the middle. So each section is its own bias. When we say that the shel rosh has to be merubah, it means all 4 boxes together, all 4 bottom together have to be compressed together, and so that all together form a square. Not that each one should be square. It's not that each bias individually should be a square. Each bias individually is a rectangle. And this need for ribua is throughout the height of the bias. So it's not just that the bias, let's say, has to be merubah from a bird's eye view on top. No, it has to be merubah throughout the height of the bias. So were I to measure circumference around the bias from the halfway point, right, over here, it's got to be merubah all the way around. It's got to be merubah on all 4 sides throughout its height. The gam, and furthermore, says the Chofetz Chaim, haribua yiyah al yedei batim atzmon. It is the bias itself, the hide, the the leather of the bias itself has to be merubah. You can't go schmear something. Let's say you make the bias and then you find out that the size is not proper. So you want to build up one side by smearing some kind of a plaster or something on it, and you'll build it up. You'll make it bigger. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, you can't do that. It's got to be merubah in its construction. It has to be merubah. You can't smear anything on it. Now the reason for this is an interesting debate. They talk about what the reason for this is. If you take a look in Dirshu footnote, where is it? 214. This is not the one. I saw it somewhere else. One second. All right, he talks about this a little bit later, but l'chayr, it applies over here too. One of the reasons why the ribua can't be because of something that you apply to the exterior of the bias is because there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that discusses what happens if you make the shel roish and instead of making 4 bottom, you make 5 bottom. I don't know what you put in the 5th bias, maybe you leave it empty. But you made 5 bottom instead of 4 bottom. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says it would be puzzle. Why would it be puzzle? Because he says that the bias hachitzain has to be open to the air. It has to be roya ha'avir. It has to be open to the exterior. So the sides of the bias have to be exposed to the outside. They can't be covered with something. So if you smear something on it to build up the outside, you're covering it, and that would be a problem. Okay. Finally, we come to the Ramah. Top line, Nun Daled Amud Aleph, says the Ramah. Haga. We've spoken about the length and the width of the bias, right? We're talking all about Ribua. Ribua is all about length and width. How about height? Do the tefillin have to be a cube? Are we going to say that if this is 4 centimeters and this is 4 centimeters, maybe the height has to be 4 centimeters? Do we have to have a cube? Says the Ramah, no. Avo. Goiva habotim, when it comes to the height of the bottom, ein lahakpid imhu yoise merachban va'arkan. There's no hakpada on the height. The tefillin could be taller than they are long and wide. Years back, there was somebody who was making tefillin, which, I don't know, they were supposed to have some kind of special hidur, and they called them stovepipe tefillin, because the shalyad was very, very tall. So it was merubah in the length and the width, but certainly the height was a lot more than the length and the width. And the Ramah says that's not a problem. Ein lahakbid imu yoser merachban ve'arkan. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Is there Mishnah Berurah here? No Mishnah Berurah. Weiter. There is a bir halacha here. Dibra maschel ein lahakbid. He just says the ribua loy nemar ela al orech v'roichav. We only find this requirement of ribua on the length and the width, not on the height. Second line in the Shulchan Aruch says the Machaber. What happens asa'am mirubois? Let's say you manufactured your tefillin and they were merubah. When you got them from the Batamacher, they were beautiful. They were merubah. The achazman the skalkel ribuan, but then over time you lost the ribua, and this is something which is common. And the reason it's common is, especially by the shel roish, people wear the shel roish when it's brand new. It's beautifully merubah, but then they wear it on their head and on their hair, and it gets sweaty. And the oil is absorbed by this natural material, the leather. And then sometimes what happens is the bias curls. It gets soft, and it starts to get rounded like the shape of the head. Now, if the titura becomes rounded so that at the two sides it's pointing down, that forces the individual four bottom of the shalrosh to start to spread apart, right? It opens up, it spreads apart. Now, if this is going to spread apart over here, then obviously you're going to lose the ribua, because now it's going to be longer in this direction than it is wide in this direction, because this spread open, and you'll lose the ribua. So says Mechaber, what happens if you lose the ribua? Asam merubah yisvachazman niskalkel ribuan. Yesh mi she'omer shetzarich lerabon. Now, if we translate these words literally, it sounds like he's saying there is someone who says that you have to fix it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this yesh mi she'omer, there's nobody who argues on it. If you lose the ribua, you must fix it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut and kofayin test, niskalkel ribuan. Kigoin, for example, shenis akmu habatim, where the bottoms start to twist apart. They're no longer, when he means nisakmu, they're not going straight up anymore, the individual bottom. Instead, they began to peel apart. So now, that means, if they peel apart, that means that the outer bottom, or all of them, right, they're going to start to go up at an angle, instead of going straight. So this bias and this bias, they spread apart. They're going at an angle, and this one is going like this, and this one's going like that, and now you're not going to have the ribua anymore. Oishin eskalkel chude abatim legamri, or, it's very important, the wording of the Mishnah Berurah here. Oishin eskalkel chude abatim legamri, or the corners of the bias got ruined. Legamri, they got totally ruined. Ad shenase ogoil, so that they are round. Don't come to me with your bias and like this. It's a little bit worn out, It's not so sharp. If I take a magnifying glass, no, that's fine. If it's the skalkel legamri, if it's totally ruined, ad shenase ogoil, so that it's round, that's when you have a problem with the corners. I heard over from Rabbi Yashiv, somebody, a Batamacha, brought a bias to Rabbi Yashiv and smacked it on the table and asked him, is it okay? He said yes. He took the next corner, he smashed it on the table, and he ground it on the table. Rabbi Yashiv said it's fine. Finally, on the fourth corner, he went to a cement wall and he really, really damaged it. And he asked Rabbi Yashiv if it's okay, and Rabbi Yashiv looked at it and said, no, it's not muhuder. If you could, you should fix it. But even that, he didn't want to say was puzzle. So it's, if it looks square, I can tell you right now, you can't see it on the camera. This is an old pair of tefillin. These corners are a little bit worn down. But Rabbi, I look at it. It's square. This looks like a square. Doesn't look like it has round corners. Nira le'inayim. If it's nira le'inayim that it's okay, then it's okay. So oishin eskalkel chude abatim legamri ad shenase ogoil, oishin eskalkel atitura, or if the titura got messed up, or hatfira, or the stitching, ad she'ibdu ribuan, until you lost the ribua. Ois cotton kuf pei, said the Mechaber, yesh mi she'omer, says the Mishnah Berurah, ain't chaylik bazeh. There's no one who argues on this. V'derech ha-Mechaber kain b'harbe mekaymois. This is the way that the Mechaber writes his language every now and then, where he writes yesh mi she'omer, where even though there's nobody who argues, we had this earlier when it came to the halacha of a ches. If you had a ches where the what was it called, the chutra, the triangle on the top of the ches is not connected, yesh mi she'omer, that's a problem. Nobody disagrees. It is a problem. Kuf pei aleph shetzarich l'rabban. You have to fix it and make it square. To Kevin de Ribuan who halacha l'moshe misinai, because since, like the Gemara in Sanhedrin, tefillin merubah halacha l'moshe misinai, b'chol shaita be'inan shiyu meruban. They always have to be merubah. It doesn't matter when you manufactured it, it was merubah. If it's not merubah now, it's a problem. So you have to fix it. When we come up, nevertheless, ain't tzarich l'moidedan b'chol yom. The Chavetz Chaim says, you're not mechuyev to carry a ruler with you and measure your tefillin every morning in ribuam kaim to see if it's still ribua. Shema'amidim oisam al cheskasam. It has a chazaka that it's meruba. Im loy sharoya shenis kalkal, unless you see a problem. Vim nisakim atitura. If the titura is bending, av shebe'etzem hu meruba, even though really, if you measure it, it is square. Rak makmas his akmos hatitura nires k'moy she'ena meruba, but it's bending, it's curving. So now it looks like it's not meruba. Yachzar v'yisake, and you do have to fix it. What he means is, if you take a measuring instrument and you measure it linearly, it will still be a square, but it doesn't look meruba because it's curving. He says that is something that you should fix. Now we go 3 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch. Last word on the line with the Ramah. Haga. V'yaseh kol ha'arba batim b'shaveh. The 4 individual batim of the sharosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, they should be equal in size. You should not have one bigger than the other. Yeah, so the Ramah said, V'yaseh kol ha'arba batim b'shaveh. He brings this down from the Baruch Sha'amar. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'yasek kuf pei beis, u'b'di'evet afilu echad racha bechaver kosher. But if one is bigger than another one, it still is kosher b'di'evet. Now we go to Sif Mem. A halacha most people are familiar with, and that is the need for the batim to be black. Says the Mechaber, Or habatim, the hide that the batim are made out of, mitzvah. Mechaber says over here, not halacha l'moshe b'Sinai. He says mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that the batim la'asosai shachar, to make them black. V'ayin l'kamon Siman Lamed Gimel. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kuf Pei Gimel. Habatim v'chol shkein sheyadaktek shashin yeh shachar. Definitely we have to take care that the shin on the bias should be black. The shin on each side. The shin definitely we have to be careful should be black. Sometimes it happens that when the tefillin get old, the black starts to come off, and we have to make sure to re-blacken it. Kuf Pei Daled, the mitzvah. The Mechaber says it's a mitzvah that the bottom should be black. Mashma, the implication is, that b'di'evet, if it's not black, it's not makiv. V'yesh paiskim, but there are paiskim, who hold to hu halacha l'moshe b'Sinai, that it's halacha l'moshe b'Sinai that the bottom have to be black. K'moi haritzuas. We know that by the ritzuas, there's halacha l'moshe b'Sinai that the ritzuas have to be black. Question is there a halacha l'moshe b'Sinai that the bottom have to be black? So that, the Mechaber says, it's a mitzvah. It's so b'di'evet, if they're not black, it's okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there are those that say that just as there's a halacha l'moshe b'Sinai that the ritzuas need to be black, so too does halacha l'moshe b'Sinai that the bottom need to be black, and if so, it would be possible b'di'evet. Uli kuvahu afilu b'di'evet. Yeah. Ubebir agra b'ashmashu b'tzadik kei lahalacha. From the Bir Agra, it's mashma that he leaned towards saying that it is a halacha l'moshe b'Sinai that the bottom have to be black. V'chein b'Yeshuas Yaakov, v'chein mashma bel Yerabba b'shar k'nas agdola t'yesh lahachmir imloi b'makom d'lo yefsher. Unless you're stuck, you don't have any other tefillin. Sheyesh lismay chadivrei amakilin k'dei shaloi lehispatel mimitzvus tefillin. If you're stuck and the only tefillin that you have, the bottom, are not black, so we're not going to tell you that you should be machmir. No, then you should be mekel, so you shouldn't be mavatal from the mitzvah of tefillin. Kuf pei hey. Shachar, they should be black. V'hashachrus, and the blackness, toiv yoiser, it is much better, sheyia b'tzeva shachar, that it should be blackened with a black dye, she'ein by mamish klal, that has no substance to it. So it's like a liquid, a paint that gets absorbed into the bias. It's not a covering over the bias. It's not something sheyesh by mamish, something that has substance that's covering the bias. Rather, it's something that's ein by mamish and is absorbed into the bias. And again, that's because the bias is not supposed to be covered. The bias is supposed to be exposed to the outside. So we don't want to cover it like with black paper. We don't want to do that. we want to paint it with a paint she'ein mamish. V'atfilin yu shchayrim rak b'chazusa ba'alma. The tefillin should be black in its appearance, but not that it should have something that's covering it over. Afal pishi, no, I skipped. Umikam makom, nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, hamashchirin b'min glantz. Some people who blacken the bias of the tefillin, this sounds almost like a wax, like a black wax. She'iev shalakalpai, it's not something that you could peel off. You see, the most of the paints that we use, you can't peel it off. It's absorbed. So he says there was this paint called glantz, like a type of a glantz. Sounds to me like a wax, that you could scrape it off. But it won't come off in one piece. It won't peel off. It'll crumble off. Like paint, right? You can scratch the paint off. And you'll get paint chips that will come off. So the Mishnah Berurah says that if you did blacken it with this glantz, that could come off, but it'll come off in little pieces. Ein lahachmer b'di'evet. B'di'evet, we don't have to be machmer. V'ayim mamash kesavdu b'sif b'em ches b'bir alachem b'shem b'bir b'gadim. Shadaita gam kein da ein lahachmer b'zeh. Achein. Mashachitshu seifreis manenu. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Chavetz Chaim, this novelty that some seifrim in our time came up with, shemashchirin beticha, where they blacken the bias with a shmear, sheyecholen likleif b'shleimus mikol tzad min atfilin. This shmear dries onto the tefillin, but now if you want, you can mamish peel it off. V'tzurasai kimin yar shachar. When you peel it off, you end up with like a black piece of paper. Zeu puzzle, that is puzzle, because that's considered a covering on the bias. It's not considered that the bias was dyed. It's considered that you covered the bias with something, which we have seen could be problematic. We had this problem recently with ritzuas. We're not discussing ritzuas here. We're going to discuss ritzuas later. But there was a type of paint that they were using on the ritzua where you could take the ritzua and peel it right off in one piece. It was like a piece of electric tape. Imagine you took a ritzua and you wanted to make it black. So you took electric tape and you ran electric tape along the whole ritzua. That's what this paint was like. You could literally peel a corner and peel it all off in one piece, and you're left with a white ritzua and a piece of black tape. Says the Mishnah Berurah, at least in the context of batim, he's saying that that's 100% puzzle. You could peel it off, and you end up with like black paper. Zehu puzzle. He brings us that Mesevet Nishmas Adam. Vishahiskiv itay agan bal beis meir deloy kenay de Yehuda. Kof Pevav, like it says in Siman Lamed Gimel, b'sif Daled B'Hagah, and that is talking about, I forgot. Okay. Kuf Pei Vav. Okay, over there in Siman Lamed Gimel, we're talking about the need to make the ritzuas and the batim black, and that it has to be done lishma. I think what he's pointing out is that in Siman Lamed Gimel Sif Dal, the Mechaber says toiv sheyashchirem Yisrael lishman. It would be good, but it's not liikuva. So too over here, when we say that the Arabatim is a mitzvah la'asaysay shachar, he's sending us over to Siman Lamed Gimel Sif Daled to explain that the Mechaber says it's a mitzvah, but it's not a strict requirement like he says over there. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue with, we'll go weiter in the Mechaber in the next chair, and we're up to Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Kuf Pei Zayin. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. Discuss of Liman HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. Baruch should say Yeshua Sefuris Parnasset Sheduchim Tolos in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Girl Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.